You're watching the Everything Network. Ethiopia's war history begins in the highlands, the Red Sea corridors, the caravan roads, and the old royal centers where power depended on control of land, trade, cattle, salt, gold, soldiers, and sacred legitimacy. This was not a small military tradition on the edge of world history. It was one of the oldest continuous war zones of state power in Africa, shaped by kings who built stone monuments, fielded armies across mountains, fought for ports, defended Christian courts, attacked and absorbed rival regions, and endured invasions from nearby sultanates, foreign empires, and modern mechanized states. The fighting was never only about battlefield glory. It was about routes to the Red Sea, tribute from the lowlands, command of the northern plateau, access to firearms, loyalty from nobles, and the survival of royal authority across terrain that punished weak armies. The first major war kingdom in this story was the Kingdom of Aksum. Aksum was an ancient Ethiopian and Eritrean highland kingdom centered around the northern plateau, with its heartland near the city of Aksum in present-day Tigray. Its rulers controlled upland farms, trade roads, ivory routes, and Red Sea commerce through the port of Adulis. The Aksumite king was not a local chief with a small hill fort. He ruled through tribute, armed retainers, nobles, merchants, religious authority, and military campaigns that reached into the Red Sea world. Aksum's armies moved through hard country, with infantry, spearmen, cavalry where terrain allowed, pack animals, and royal war parties attached to the power of the throne. Aksum itself was a royal city of stone, monuments, tombs, churches, and court ritual. Its rulers raised tall stelae, minted coins, and spoke in the language of kings who wanted the Red Sea and the Nile corridor to recognize their strength. A king in Aksum needed control over the plateau first. He needed farmers to produce grain, nobles to provide fighters, priests and court officials to support legitimacy, and road chiefs to keep caravans moving. Any enemy who broke the road to Adulis could cut the kingdom's outside wealth. Any rival who rose in the highlands could threaten the king's authority from inside the mountain world. One of the strongest known Aksumite rulers was King Ezana. King Ezana ruled in the 4th century and became one of the most important figures in Ethiopian history. He is remembered for expanding royal power, leaving inscriptions, and adopting Christianity as a royal faith. His reign linked war, religion, and kingship in a way that would shape Ethiopia for centuries. When Ezana recorded campaigns, he presented himself as a conquering king who punished revolt, took captives, seized cattle, and forced enemies back under royal power. These were not symbolic victories. They were the basic language of highland rule. Defeat the rebels, take the herds, break the chiefs, and prove the throne still carried authority. Ezana's campaigns reached against groups around the kingdom's frontiers and against peoples who resisted Aksumite authority. In these early wars, cattle were wealth, captives were labor and political proof, and tribute showed who had submitted. A town taken by Aksum did not only lose a wall or a market, it lost independence. Its chiefs had to face the king's agents. Its livestock could be driven off. Its young men could be absorbed, punished, or watched. A ruler who failed to answer Aksum's demand risked an expedition sent through rough valleys and dry roads, with royal troops taking the old measures of victory: animals, prisoners, weapons, and submission. Aksum's greatest strategic advantage was its position between Africa and the Red Sea trade. Adulis connected the highlands to merchants from Arabia, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean routes. A war for Aksum could become a war for the coast. Whoever held the port could bring in goods, metal, luxury items, religious influence, and foreign connections. Whoever lost access to the sea became more dependent on inland tribute and mountain defense. This theme returned again and again in Ethiopian history. The highland state could be powerful, but sea access could make it richer, better connected, and harder to isolate. Aksum also projected force across the Red Sea into South Arabia. Ethiopian tradition and outside records remember Aksumite involvement in Yemen, where rulers and armies crossed the water into a world of rival kings, religious struggles, and trade cities. The Red Sea was not a quiet boundary, it was a military road. Ships moved soldiers, horses, supplies, priests, envoys, and royal ambition across it. When Aksumite power reached Yemen, it showed that the kingdom was not merely defending mountain farms. It was fighting for influence in one of the most valuable corridors between Africa, Arabia, and the wider world. The South Arabian campaigns also showed the limits of distant rule. A king could send men across the sea, install allies, punish enemies, and claim glory. Holding that power was harder. Local rivalries, supply distance, religious division, and foreign pressure could grind down an expeditionary system. The kingdom of Aksum's military strength came from the highlands. The farther the army moved from that base, the more it needed ships, ports, loyal allies, and steady supply. A campaign across water always demanded more than courage. It demanded administration, money, and command discipline. By the later Aksumite period, the world around the kingdom changed. The rise of Islam transformed the Red Sea and Arabian trade networks. New Muslim powers controlled ports, routes, and political relations that Aksum had once used for influence. This did not erase Ethiopia's Christian kingdom, but it changed its war environment. The old Red Sea world became more contested. The highland kingdom's center of gravity shifted inland. Mountain defense, mobile courts, control of Christian monasteries, and war against lowland rivals became more important. Ethiopia did not vanish. It changed its military posture. The decline of Aksum was not a single battlefield collapse. It was a long reduction of reach, wealth, and direct coastal command. The old royal city lost some of its central position. Power moved through other highland centers. Trade shifted. Local dynasties rose. The memory of Aksum remained powerful, especially as a source of Christian royal legitimacy, but later Ethiopian kings ruled a different battlefield. They inherited the idea of sacred kingship and imperial authority, while fighting in a harder political field where Muslim sultanates, regional lords, and mobile aristocrats could challenge the throne. After Aksum came the Zagwe dynasty, a ruling house often associated with the Lasta region and the rock-hewn church complex at Lalibela. The Zagwe kings were Christian rulers who controlled parts of the highlands after the older Aksumite order weakened. Their world was not peaceful stonework and church building alone. A dynasty that carved churches still had to command soldiers, collect tribute, hold roads, and face rivals. King Lalibela, the most famous Zagwe ruler, is remembered as a builder and saintly king, but royal building on that scale required political security, labor control, and enough armed authority to keep enemies from tearing the realm apart. The Zagwe era shows an important Ethiopian pattern. Kingship was not fixed in one capital with a simple bureaucracy like a later European court. Royal power often moved. The king travelled with a court, camp, soldiers, clergy, servants, and stores. This mobile kingship allowed the ruler to appear in contested regions, take tribute, punish rebels, and keep nobles from growing too independent. It also meant the kingdom was always at risk when the royal army was weak. If nobles withheld troops, if frontier chiefs stopped paying, if rivals controlled mountain passes, the king's authority could shrink fast. The next great transformation came with the rise of the Solomonic dynasty in the late 13th century. The Solomonic kings claimed descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and that claim became one of the strongest political ideas in Ethiopian royal history. The dynasty was not only a family line, it was an argument for rightful rule. A Solomonic king stood as defender of the Christian kingdom, lord of the highlands, protector of the church, and commander of war against internal and external enemies. That claim gave the throne sacred weight, but sacred weight did not hold a province. Soldiers did. King Yekuno Amlak was the founder of the restored Solomonic line. He overthrew the Zagwe order and placed his dynasty at the center of Ethiopian kingship. he was not just a claimant with a story. He was a successful political and military operator who gathered support from nobles and churchmen and used force to take the throne. His rise shows how Ethiopian kingship worked when legitimacy and violence joined. A rival line could be declared improper, but it still had to be defeated. A king could claim holy descent, but he still needed men with spears, shields, horses, and loyalty. The Solomonic state expanded through war against surrounding peoples, pressure on frontier communities, and campaigns into regions that did not always accept the king's authority. Ethiopia's emperors, often called Negus-Negast, or King of Kings, ruled through a layered system of nobles, provincial rulers, tribute obligations, church ties, and military force. The title itself admitted the political reality. The emperor was king over other rulers. Those rulers could support him, resist him, delay him, or rebel against him. Ethiopian war history in this period was often a contest between center and province, as much as a contest between Christian and Muslim states. One of the major medieval rulers was Emperor Amda Seyon I. Amda Seyon ruled in the 14th century and stands as one of Ethiopia's strongest warrior kings. He expanded imperial power, fought Muslim sultanates, punished rebellious nobles, and projected Ethiopian force deep into the surrounding regions. He was the kind of king war audiences remember: active, ruthless when challenged, and determined to make rival rulers understand that refusal carried a price. His campaigns pushed against Ifat and other Muslim polities that controlled lowland routes and threatened imperial influence. Ifat was a Muslim sultanate located in the eastern regions around the trade routes between the highlands and the Red Sea-linked lowlands. Its rulers were not minor raiders. They controlled towns, merchants, warriors, and strategic corridors that connected Ethiopia to the wider Islamic world. For the Christian Empire, Ifat was both a rival and a gatekeeper. For Ifat, the Ethiopian highland throne was a dangerous neighbor that could interfere with trade, demand submission, and strike into sultanate lands. The conflict between Amda Seyon and Ifat was a war over authority, religion, commerce, and the right to command the borderlands. Amda Seyon's campaigns were hard marches through enemy territory. Ethiopian forces had to move from highland bases into lower, hotter, and more exposed regions. The army needed food, water, animals, scouts, and local guides. Towns that resisted could be stormed or forced into surrender. Captured chiefs could be executed, imprisoned, or made examples before their followers. When the emperor defeated a sultanate force, he did not only win a battle. He broke a political network, seized tribute, and warned other rulers that the imperial army could come down from the highlands and reach them. The Wars of Amda Seyon also had a religious edge, but the practical side stayed clear. Muslim sultanates wanted autonomy and control of trade. Christian emperors wanted obedience, tribute, and strategic security. The borderlands were mixed zones of merchants, farmers, pastoralists, holy men, soldiers, and chiefs. When war entered these regions, towns could change hands, wells could be guarded, caravans could be blocked, and civilians could be pulled into the violence through tax demands, forced supply, or punishment after revolt. Zara Yacob's rule was severe. He demanded loyalty from nobles and clergy. He dealt harshly with those accused of opposing royal and religious order. In a war kingdom, doctrine and command could become one system. A rebel noble was not only a political problem, he could be framed as a threat to the Christian order. A religious dissenter was not only a church problem, he could become a security danger in a state where unity helped keep soldiers, tribute, and provincial obedience in line. Zara Yacob strengthened the crown through discipline, fear, and direct royal pressure. By the late medieval period, the Eastern Muslim sultanates remained a permanent danger to the Christian highland state. The most important of these powers was Adal. The Adal Sultanate was a Muslim state based in the Eastern Horn, linked to trade routes, lowland warriors, Somali and Harari forces, and wider Islamic connections. Adol's rulers and commanders understood the Highland Kingdom's strengths and weaknesses. They knew the Ethiopian state could field large armies, but those armies depended on noble levies, terrain, supplies, and slow movement. A skilled Adol commander could use speed, firearms, cavalry, and religious mobilization to turn border warfare into a full assault on the empire. That commander was Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, remembered in Ethiopian tradition as Ahmad Grang, meaning Ahmad the left-handed. He was military leader of the Adal Sultanate in the 16th century, and he became one of the most dangerous enemies the Ethiopian Empire ever faced. Ahmad was not only a raider, he was a campaign commander with political authority, religious appeal, and enough operational skill to smash imperial armies and push deep into Christian Ethiopia. His wars nearly destroyed the Solomonic state. His name stayed in Ethiopian memory as a figure of devastation, fear, and military shock. The Ethiopian Adal War began as border conflict and became a national catastrophe for the Christian Empire. Ahmad Grang's forces used mobile tactics, disciplined leadership, and firearms obtained through wider Red Sea connections. Firearms changed the battlefield. Ethiopian armies had fought many wars with spears, swords, shields, archers, cavalry, and massed noble levies. Gunpowder weapons did not instantly erase older methods, but they gave a trained force a severe advantage in shock, noise, penetration, and battlefield intimidation. A line that could endure arrows might break under gunfire and coordinated attack. Emperor Lebna Dengel ruled Ethiopia when Ahmad's campaigns became a mortal threat. Lebna Dengel was the Solomonic emperor, a Christian king tasked with defending the realm, but he faced an enemy who moved fast and hit hard. Ahmad's army defeated Ethiopian forces in major engagements and forced the imperial court into flight. Towns, churches, monasteries, and royal centers came under threat. The war was not contained near the frontier. It came into the highlands, the heart of Ethiopian Christian power. Ahmad's forces captured and burned major religious and political sites. Churches were looted or destroyed. Monasteries were attacked. Provinces that had been under imperial authority were forced into submission. Local rulers had to choose between resistance, flight, surrender, or collaboration. The war tore through the system that had supported the Solomonic throne for centuries. The emperor could no longer assume that distance, mountains, and noble levies would protect the interior. Ahmad had turned the eastern frontier into an invasion route. The capture of towns during Ahmad's campaigns carried more than tactical value. A town gave food, hostages, prestige, and a message to nearby districts. When one fortified place fell, the next ruler had to decide whether to fight or submit. If a church center fell, the blow hit the spiritual authority of the Christian kingdom. If a market town fell, supply and tax flow changed hands. If a noble defected or surrendered, the emperor's army lost men and local intelligence. Ahmad's war worked through battlefield victories and the steady collapse of imperial control in province after province. Lebna Dengel spent his later years under pressure, trying to hold together a kingdom that had lost much of its fighting capacity. He appealed for outside Christian aid, especially from Portugal. Portugal had entered the Indian Ocean and Red Sea world as a naval and military power, fighting Muslim states and trying to control trade routes. For Ethiopia, Portuguese firearms and soldiers offered a possible answer to Ahmad's gunpowder advantage. For Portugal, Ethiopia was a Christian ally in a wider struggle against Muslim powers around the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Lebna Dengel died before the recovery was complete. His son, Emperor Gelawdewos, inherited the war. Gelawdewos was a young Solomonic ruler who faced a broken military situation and an enemy still capable of destroying the empire. He had to rebuild morale, coordinate with Portuguese allies, and fight a commander who had already humbled the Highland Kingdom. Gelawdewos was not inheriting a stable throne. He was inheriting a survival war. The Portuguese expedition reached Ethiopia under Cristóvão da Gama. the son of the famous navigator Vasco da Gama. Cristóvão da Gama was a Portuguese commander sent with a small but important force armed with firearms. His men were not numerous enough to conquer the region on their own, but their weapons and training gave the Ethiopian side a badly needed edge. In a war where gunpowder had shifted the balance, several hundred disciplined foreign musketeers could influence the outcome of key battles. Cristóvão da Gama fought Ahmad's forces and at first helped stiffen Ethiopian resistance. The Portuguese brought matchlocks, armor, and battlefield confidence. They also brought danger to themselves. A small foreign force deep inside Ethiopia could not afford isolation. If cut off, surrounded, or trapped, it could be destroyed. Ahmad understood the danger of letting Portuguese firepower combine fully with Ethiopian manpower. He moved to crush them before that combination could become decisive. Cristóvão da Gama was eventually captured after a defeat and executed by Ahmad Grang. His death became a brutal symbol of the war's stakes. The Portuguese commander had entered Ethiopia as a rescuer and died as a prisoner in a conflict that punished every mistake. His surviving men continued to matter. The firearms they brought and the military pressure they helped create still contributed to the final Ethiopian recovery. Gelawdewos could use the remaining Portuguese strength, Ethiopian levies, and renewed royal determination to reverse the war. The decisive turn came at the Battle of Wayna Daga in 1543. Emperor Gelawdewos led Ethiopian forces against Ahmad Gran. Portuguese survivors fought alongside them. Ahmad's army, which had once driven deep into the Christian highlands, now faced an enemy that had adapted. The battle ended with Ahmad killed. His death shattered the central force of the Adal invasion. In a war built around his leadership, charisma, and operational command, the loss of Ahmad was not only the death of a general, it removed the man who held the invasion together. Wayna Daga saved the Solomonic state from destruction. It did not restore everything immediately. Towns had been ruined, churches had been burned, provinces had shifted allegiance, noble families had been killed, displaced, or compromised. The Ethiopian Empire survived, but it emerged damaged and changed. The war had shown that the kingdom could be nearly broken by a commander with speed, firearms, religious mobilization, and support from lowland networks. It also showed that Ethiopia could endure a near-fatal invasion, absorb foreign military aid, and return to the field under a new emperor. The aftermath was not peace. The old balance had been smashed. Adal declined after Ahmad's death, but eastern warfare continued. The Oromo migrations and expansions transformed the political map of Ethiopia and the surrounding regions. Oromo groups moved into large areas of the south, center, and east, often through armed migration, settlement, alliance, and conflict. These movements changed the ethnic, military, and political structure of the Ethiopian world. Some groups fought the empire, some entered imperial service, some became regional powers. Over time, Oromo nobles and cavalry became deeply involved in Ethiopian politics. The Oromo expansions were not a single invasion under one king. They were waves of movement by organized groups with their own age-grade military systems, cattle culture, leadership structures, and war traditions. They entered regions weakened by earlier wars between the Christian Empire and Adal. Settlements, grazing lands, and tribute zones changed hands. Older provincial orders collapsed in some areas. The Solomonic state had to adjust to a new military and demographic reality. The map after Ahmad Grang was not the map before him. The Ethiopian emperors in the later 16th and 17th centuries faced a harder internal field. They had to hold Christian highland authority while managing Oromo expansion, noble independence, regional warlords, religious disputes, and foreign influence. The old royal solution remained the same in principle: move the court, summon armies, punish defiance, reward loyal chiefs, and anchor legitimacy in the church. The execution was harder. Armies could be large, but uneven. Nobles could arrive late, bring fewer men than ordered, or use imperial weakness to bargain for power. Emperor Susenyos, who ruled in the early 17th century, was one of the most important rulers in this troubled period. Susenyos was a Solomonic emperor and a warrior king who fought Oromo groups, rival nobles, and internal challengers. He also became tied to Catholic influence through Jesuit missionaries, a decision that triggered deep unrest. His reign showed how foreign religion, court politics, and battlefield authority could collide. A king who could win wars still risked tearing his own realm apart if the church and nobles believed he had broken the religious order. Susenyos fought hard to impose royal control. He campaigned against enemies, tried to strengthen the throne, and used force against rebellion. Yet his religious policy created a crisis that military success could not solve. Ethiopia's Orthodox Christian identity had become central to imperial legitimacy. When Susenyos embraced Catholicism under Jesuit influence, many subjects and nobles saw it as an attack on the inherited faith. Revolt followed. The emperor faced not only armed enemies, but a legitimacy wound inside the empire. Susenyos eventually abdicated in favor of his son Fasilides. Emperor Fasilides restored Ethiopian Orthodox authority and rejected the Catholic project. He founded Gondar as a major royal center, and the Gondarine period began. Gondar became a city of castles, churches, noble houses, and royal display. It gave the empire a more fixed court culture, though war did not vanish. Behind the stone walls and royal compounds, nobles still competed, regional armies still mattered, and the throne still depended on the ability to command force. The Gondarine period produced kings, queens, generals, and court factions who fought for influence around the imperial center. Gondar was not only a capital of buildings, it was a place where power could be watched, contested, and seized. A noble who controlled access to the emperor could shape policy. A commander with troops near the court could become kingmaker. A royal marriage could bind factions for a time, then fail when military interests changed. Ethiopian politics stayed armed, even when it wore court clothing. By the 18th century, imperial authority weakened into the Zemene Mesafint, the era of the princes. This was one of the most fractured periods in Ethiopian history. The emperor still existed, but real power often belonged to regional lords and military strongmen. The Yeju Oromo regents, Tigrayan lords, Amhara nobles, and other regional powers fought for influence. Gondar remained symbolically important, but the man on the throne could become a controlled figure while warlords ruled in practice. The era of the princes was a long age of shifting alliances, regional campaigns, and noble violence. Armies marched from Tigray, Begemder, Gojam, Shiwa, Wollo, and other regions. Battles were fought to place or control emperors, seize tribute, punish rivals, and dominate routes. Capturing a town in this period meant gaining tax rights, supplies, hostages, and prestige. A ruler who took Gondar could claim influence over the imperial center, but holding the empire required more than entering the capital. It required bargaining with other armed princes who had their own men, horses, fortresses, and ambitions. This fractured order created the conditions for one of Ethiopia's most forceful 19th century rulers, Emperor Tewodros II. Tewodros was born Kasa Hailu. He rose from the world of regional conflict and became a warrior unifier. He was not handed a stable empire. He fought his way upward through the chaos of the princes, defeated rivals, and crowned himself emperor in 1855. Tewodros wanted to restore central authority, break the power of rebellious nobles, modernize the army, and force Ethiopia back into unity under one crown. Tewodros was a violent reformer. He understood that the old aristocracy could not be politely managed into obedience. He moved against regional lords, confiscated property, punished betrayal, and tried to create a more direct royal command. He wanted firearms, artillery, skilled craftsmen, and stronger administration. He also had a severe temper and could turn on prisoners, nobles, and foreign captives when frustrated. His reign had the energy of restoration and the danger of personal rule under pressure. Tewodros's wars were fought across difficult terrain against nobles who knew how to resist central power. Regional chiefs could retreat into mountain strongholds, cut supply lines, wait out royal armies, and return after the emperor moved on. A king who wanted to unify Ethiopia had to defeat not one enemy, but a whole class of armed local power. Each campaign consumed food, time, animals, loyalty, and gunpowder. Tewodros won many fights, but every victory created new resentment among men who had lost rank or land. The British expedition to Magdala in 1868 became the catastrophic end of Tewodros's reign. The crisis began with diplomatic failure and the imprisonment of British envoys and other Europeans. Britain responded with an enormous expeditionary force that landed on the Red Sea coast and marched inland. This was not a raid by a few adventurers. It was a major imperial operation with engineers, artillery, transport animals, Indian Army troops, British regulars, and a logistical system built to cross brutal terrain and reach the emperor's fortress. Magdala was Tewodros's mountain stronghold. It stood as a fortress of royal pride and final resistance. The British advance showed the difference between a modern imperial expedition and a regional Ethiopian army under strain. Roads were built. Supplies were pushed forward. Artillery moved across hard country. Local Ethiopian rivals did not unite behind Tewodros. Some assisted the British or withheld support from the emperor. Tewodros faced foreign attack and domestic isolation at the same time. At the Battle of Orogye, near Magdala, Tewodros's forces attacked the British-led army and were crushed by disciplined rifle fire and artillery. Ethiopian fighters showed courage, but courage alone could not close the gap against modern firearms in prepared hands. Men went down in front of weapons that fired faster, farther, and with more killing power than most Ethiopian forces could answer. The road to Magdala opened. Tewodros released some captives, but the British continued. The fortress was stormed. Tewodros chose suicide rather than capture. He died at Magdala in 1868, ending one of the fiercest attempts to reunify Ethiopia through royal force. The British looted Magdala and withdrew, leaving Ethiopia to its own political struggle. Tewodros failed to create lasting unity, but his reign marked the return of the centralizing emperor as a military figure. He showed that the era of the princes could be challenged. He also showed how dangerous centralization became when reform, pride, foreign pressure, and internal rebellion converged. After Tewodros came Emperor Yohannes IV, born Kasamercha of Tigray. Yohannes was a northern ruler who became emperor in 1872 and spent much of his reign defending Ethiopia from foreign invasion and internal division. He was a Christian monarch with a warrior's authority, shaped by Tigrayan power, highland politics, and the need to face Egypt, Madis Sudan, and rival Ethiopian rulers. Yohannes did not rule a calm empire. He ruled a fortress state under pressure from several directions. Egypt, under the Khedivate, pushed south and inland during the 19th century. Egyptian rulers wanted influence around the Red Sea, Sudan, and the Horn of Africa. Their armies moved into territories claimed or contested by Ethiopia. This brought Yohannes into war with an Egyptian force that had modern weapons and foreign-trained officers. The Egyptians expected pressure, intimidation, and superior arms to force Ethiopia into submission. They misread the highlands and the emperor commanding them. The Battle of Gundet in 1875 was a severe defeat for Egypt. Ethiopian forces, under Yohannes and his commanders, trapped and destroyed an Egyptian column in difficult terrain. The Egyptian army suffered heavily, losing men, weapons, and prestige. The battle showed how an invading army with modern equipment could still be ruined by terrain, overconfidence, and Ethiopian tactical positioning. In the highlands, roads narrowed, movement slowed, and local knowledge became a weapon. The next year, Egypt tried again and suffered another major defeat at the Battle of Gura in 1876. Yohannes's forces faced a larger Egyptian army and beat it back. Gura confirmed Ethiopian strength and damaged Egyptian ambitions in the region. For Yohannes, These victories strengthened his standing as a defender of the Christian empire against foreign invasion. For Egypt, they showed that Ethiopia could not be treated as an easy frontier. The Highland army had defeated a state with modern weapons and imperial ambition. Johannes also faced the Mahdist state rising in Sudan. The Mahdists were a militant Islamic movement that overthrew Egyptian rule in Sudan and created a powerful war state under the Mahdi and then his successors. Their forces threatened Ethiopia's western and northwestern frontiers. This conflict brought raiding, religious war, frontier devastation, and major battles. Johannes had to defend the empire while managing powerful internal nobles, including Menelik of Shewa, who was rising as a major southern ruler. The Battle of Galabat in 1889 ended Johannes's reign. Ethiopian forces fought Mahdist troops near the Sudanese frontier. Johannes was wounded in battle and died soon after. His death turned a military campaign into a succession crisis. A living emperor could hold rival nobles in line through command and fear. A dead emperor opened the field for the next claimant. The man who emerged was Menelik of Shewa, already one of the most powerful figures in Ethiopia. Menelik II became emperor in 1889. Menelik was king of Shewa before becoming emperor, and he stands as one of the most consequential rulers in Ethiopian history. He expanded the empire southward, incorporated vast territories, built a stronger state, imported firearms, negotiated with foreign powers, founded Addis Ababa as the capital, and led Ethiopia to its most famous victory against European colonial invasion. He was a state builder and a conqueror. His reign brought unity and expansion, but also violent incorporation of peoples and regions into the imperial order. Menelik's southern campaigns reshaped Ethiopia. His armies moved into Oromo, Sidama, Walaita, Kaffa, and other regions, though each region had its own history, leadership, and mode of resistance. These campaigns brought tribute, land, soldiers, and resources into the empire. They also brought displacement, submission, enslavement in some contexts, and harsh punishment for resistance. Menelik's empire grew through war. Towns and kingdoms that resisted could face siege, assault, forced tribute, and incorporation under imperial governors. One of the most important southern campaigns was against the kingdom of Kaffa. Kaffa was a powerful southwestern kingdom with its own monarchy, forests, trade, and defenses. Menelik's forces moved against it in the 1890s. The campaign was difficult, fought in terrain that favored defenders, and slowed imperial movement. Kaffa's ruler, King Gaki Shirocho, resisted Ethiopian conquest. His defeat brought Kaffa into the expanding empire. This was not a minor annexation. It was the fall of a kingdom with its own royal history and military identity. Menelik's most famous war came against Italy. Italy had established a colony in Eritrea and wanted to expand inland. The Treaty of Wuchal, signed in 1889, became the trigger for a major crisis. The Italian and Amharic versions differed on Ethiopia's foreign relations. Italy claimed the treaty made Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. Menelik rejected that interpretation. The dispute became a test of sovereignty. Italy wanted colonial control. Menelik prepared for war. The First Italo-Ethiopian War unfolded in the 1890s. Italian forces advanced from Eritrea into northern Ethiopia. Menelik mobilized a massive army from across the empire. Empress Taitu Betul, Menelik's wife, and a major political figure, played a strong role in the anti-Italian position. She was not background decoration in this war. Taitu pushed hard against compromise, helped shape the court's resistance, and stood as one of the central figures behind Ethiopia's refusal to accept Italian domination. The Ethiopian army that gathered against Italy was large, diverse, and politically complex. It included forces from Shewa, Tigray, Gojam, Wollo, and other regions, under major commanders and nobles. Ras Makonnen, father of the future Emperor Haile Selassie, was one of Menelik's important commanders and diplomats. Ras Alula, the great Tigrayan general, was another crucial military figure with long experience fighting Egyptians, Italians, and other enemies. Menelik had to hold these forces together long enough to defeat a European army in the field. Before Adwa, Ethiopia won at Amba Alagi in 1895. Ras Makonnin's forces defeated an Italian detachment under Major Pietro Torselli. The Italian position was isolated and overrun after hard fighting. This victory weakened Italian confidence and showed that Ethiopian forces could defeat Italian troops in mountain warfare. Then came the siege of Mekelle. The Italians held the fort at Mekelle under pressure from Ethiopian forces. Menelik did not simply rush into wasteful assault. He applied pressure, cut water access, negotiated, and allowed surrender. The campaign showed patience as well as force. The decisive battle came at Adwa on March 1, 1896. The Italian commander, General Oreste Baratieri, moved his army through rough terrain in separate columns, aiming to surprise or outmaneuver the Ethiopians. The plan collapsed under poor maps, difficult ground, darkness, confusion, and Ethiopian readiness. Italian brigades became separated. Ethiopian commanders struck with numbers, local advantage, and determination. Menelik's army, with Taitu's presence in the campaign, and major nobles commanding their own forces, descended on the Italian columns and broke them. Adwa was a brutal battlefield. Italian units fought hard in places, but separation doomed them. Ethiopian forces attacked from multiple directions, closing on isolated brigades, overwhelming positions, and cutting down retreating men. Some Italian and colonial Askari troops were killed. Others were captured. Officers fell, units collapsed, and the invasion army was destroyed as an effective force. The victory forced Italy to recognize Ethiopian independence. Adwa became one of the most important anti-colonial victories in world history, won by an African empire against a European colonial army in open battle. Adwa did not make Ethiopia peaceful. It made Ethiopia independent under Menelik's state. The empire still contained many peoples brought in by conquest. The court still balanced nobles, soldiers, governors, church authorities, and foreign pressures. Menelik's reign gave Ethiopia international standing, but internal tensions remained. The army that defeated Italy was also an army of imperial expansion. Ethiopian war history carries both truths at once: resistance to European conquest and conquest inside the Horn of Africa. After Menelik, Ethiopia entered a new age under leaders including Empress Zewditu and Ras Tafari Makonnen, who later became Emperor Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie was a modernizing ruler, a centralizing emperor, and the symbol of Ethiopia during the next great Italian invasion. Italy returned under Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator who wanted revenge for Adwa and an African empire. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War began in 1935. This time, Italy came with aircraft, tanks, artillery, poison gas, and a larger colonial war machine. The Italian invasion came from Eritrea in the north and Italian Somaliland in the southeast. Marshal Emilio de Bono first led the northern advance, then Marshal Pietro Badoglio took over. In the south, General Rodolfo Graziani drove forces from Somaliland. Ethiopia's armies were brave, but many fighters lacked modern weapons, communications, anti-aircraft defense, and the logistical system needed to withstand mechanized invasion. Ethiopian commanders still used mass mobilization, terrain, local knowledge, and courage, but Italian air power and chemical weapons changed the war. Haile Selassie tried to organize national resistance. Major Ethiopian nobles and commanders took the field, including Ras Kassa, Ras Seum, Ras Mulugeta, and others. The Northern Front saw major battles in Tigray and the mountain approaches. The Italians advanced through towns such as Adwa, Aksum, and Mekelle. These names carried deep historical weight. Adwa had been the site of Italy's humiliation in 1896. Its capture in 1935 became a fascist propaganda prize, though it did not erase the earlier defeat. The Battle of Amba Aradum in February 1936 was one of the major Italian victories. Ras Mulugeta, Ethiopia's Minister of War, commanded forces in a strong mountain position. Italian troops, artillery, aircraft, and chemical weapons battered the Ethiopian army. The position was broken, and Ethiopian forces suffered heavily during retreat. This was modern war against an army not fully equipped for it. Men who could fight rifles and artillery still had few answers for aircraft overhead and gas falling into ravines, camps, and retreat routes. The Italians also used poison gas in violation of international law. Mustard gas was dropped from aircraft and used to terrorize soldiers and civilians. It burned skin, blinded men, poisoned water, and turned retreat into agony. This was not only battlefield force, it was an attempt to break an entire society's ability to resist. Villages, supply paths, and troop concentrations could be attacked from the air. Ethiopian fighters were forced to endure a form of war that reached them even when no enemy soldier stood in front of them. In the south, Graziani's campaign used harsh methods and heavy force. Ethiopian resistance was fierce in places, but Italian equipment and air support pushed the invasion forward. On the northern front, Badoglio's forces continued their advance after victories at Amba Aradam, Tembian, and Shire. The Ethiopian armies were worn down. Command coordination became harder. Local resistance continued, but the Imperial Field Army could no longer stop the Italian advance toward Addis Ababa. Haile Selassie personally took the field at the Battle of Mechu in March 1936. This was the emperor's attempt to stop the Italian drive before the road to the capital opened. Ethiopian forces attacked with determination, but Italian artillery, aircraft, fortified positions, and chemical warfare shattered the assault. The defeat at Mechu marked the collapse of organized imperial resistance in the field. Haile Selassie withdrew and eventually went into exile. Addis Ababa fell to Italian forces in May 1936. The fall of Addis Ababa did not end Ethiopian resistance. The Italians declared victory and created Italian East Africa, combining Ethiopia with Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. Yet patriots, known as Arbegnok, continued guerrilla resistance. These fighters operated from mountains, forests, rural districts, and hidden networks. They attacked convoys, assassinated collaborators, disrupted occupation, and kept Ethiopian sovereignty alive in armed form. Italy held the cities and roads more easily than it held the countryside. Italian occupation was violent. Graziani, who became viceroy, survived an assassination attempt in Addis Ababa in 1937. The Italian response was savage. Mass killings followed in the capital, and repression extended against clergy, nobles, suspected patriots, and civilians. Monasteries and religious communities faced severe punishment. Occupation rule used executions, imprisonment, terror, and racial hierarchy. Ethiopia's war did not end at conquest. It continued as occupation and resistance. During World War II, Britain and Allied forces moved against Italian East Africa. Ethiopian patriots joined the campaign. Haile Selassie returned from exile to support. The East African Campaign of 1940 to 1941 became the war that restored Ethiopia's emperor. British, Commonwealth, African, Indian, Sudanese, and Ethiopian forces fought across Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Italian Somaliland. The campaign included mountain fighting, road columns, siege operations, and battles for Italian strongpoints. The Battle of Keren in Eritrea was one of the hardest fights of the East African Campaign. Italian forces held strong mountain defences blocking the route toward Asmara and Massawa. British and Commonwealth troops attacked through steep terrain under heavy fire. Keren became a grinding battle for ridges, passes, and artillery positions. Its fall opened the way into Eritrea and helped break Italian East Africa. In Ethiopia itself, patriot forces and allied units advanced against Italian garrisons and loyalist positions. Haile Selassie re-entered Addis Ababa in May 1941. The return was a major moment in Ethiopian history. The emperor came back after exile, Italy's occupation was collapsing, and Ethiopia regained its place as an independent state. Yet the restored empire faced new pressures. The old imperial order survived the fascist invasion, but modern politics, ethnic tensions, regional grievances, land issues, Eritrea's future, and military modernization would bring new wars. Ethiopia had defeated colonization twice in different ways, at Adwa through open battle and in World War II through resistance, exile diplomacy, and allied war. The next major conflict grew around Eritrea. Eritrea had been an Italian colony, then came under British administration after Italy's defeat. In the early Cold War, Eritrea was federated with Ethiopia, then annexed by Haile Selassie's government in 1962. Eritrean resistance grew into a long independence war. The Eritrean War of Independence became one of the longest and most important conflicts in the Horn of Africa. It began as a struggle against imperial rule and continued against the later Marxist military government known as the Derg. The Eritrean fighters included the Eritrean Liberation Front and later the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. These movements fought from rugged terrain, especially in the north and along difficult mountain and desert zones. They built guerrilla networks, trained fighters, created supply systems, and took advantage of Ethiopia's political instability. The Ethiopian state had larger forces and foreign support at different times, but Eritrean fighters learned to survive under air attack, artillery, and harsh counterinsurgency. Towns such as Nakfa became symbols of endurance and resistance. Inside Ethiopia, Haile Selassie's empire fell in 1974 after famine, military unrest, student protest, elite discontent, and army mutiny. A military committee seized power. Mengistu, Haile Mariam, emerged as the dominant figure. Mengistu was a military officer and revolutionary ruler who led Ethiopia into a Marxist-Leninist dictatorship. His government used mass mobilization, Soviet support, security organs, forced resettlement, and severe violence against enemies. The Red Terror in Addis Ababa and other areas killed large numbers of suspected opponents. Under the Derg, Ethiopia became a heavily militarized state. The Eritrean War intensified. Rebellions also grew in Tigray, Oromo areas, and other regions. The Tigray People's Liberation Front, known as the TPLF, became one of the most important insurgent movements. It began as a regional guerrilla force in Tigray and later became central to the coalition that overthrew Mengistu. The Ethiopian army under the Derg was large and heavily armed, but it was fighting multiple wars across a huge country with deep political fractures. The Ogaden War of 1977 to 1978 brought Ethiopia into a major conventional war with Somalia. Somalia, led by Siad Barre, invaded the Ogaden region, an area inhabited largely by ethnic Somalis and claimed by Somalia under its Greater Somalia ideology. At first, Somali forces advanced fast, using armor, artillery, and trained troops to seize large parts of the Ogaden. Ethiopia was shaken. The Derg faced internal rebellion and now a foreign invasion. The war turned when the Soviet Union shifted support from Somalia to Ethiopia, and Cuba sent troops to help Ethiopia. Cuban forces, Soviet advisors, South Yemeni support, and Ethiopian units reorganized the defense and counterattacked. The battle for Harar was central. Harar, an ancient city in eastern Ethiopia, became a key defensive point. If Somalia had taken Harar and pushed farther, Ethiopia's eastern position would have been deeply damaged. Ethiopian and allied forces held, then drove Somali troops back. The counteroffensive broke Somalia's invasion. Ethiopian and Cuban forces pushed through the Ogaden, retook major positions, and forced Somali withdrawal. The Ogaden War strengthened the Derg in the short term and humiliated Somalia, but it did not resolve Ethiopia's internal wars. The state survived foreign invasion while insurgencies continued to grow inside its borders. This became a repeated Ethiopian pattern. Victory on one front did not end crisis on the next. By the late 1980s, the Derg was weakening. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front had become a disciplined and effective rebel army. The TPLF and its allies formed the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or EPRDF. These rebel movements fought with battlefield skill, local support networks, and growing confidence as Soviet backing for Mengistu declined. Major government offensives failed. Rebel forces captured towns, cut roads, and destroyed isolated units. The regime's army was large, but morale and supply worsened. In 1991, Mengistu fled Ethiopia. EPRDF forces entered Addis Ababa, and Eritrean forces secured Eritrea. The Derg collapsed. Eritrea later became independent after a referendum. Ethiopia entered a new political order dominated by the EPRDF, with the TPLF as its most powerful component. Meles Zenawi, a TPLF leader, became the central ruler of the new Ethiopia. He presented a federal system based on ethnic regions, but real power remained tightly controlled by the ruling coalition. The Eritrean-Ethiopian War of 1998 to 2000 shattered the post-1991 relationship between Ethiopia and newly independent Eritrea. The war began around the disputed border town of Badme, but it escalated into a full conventional war between two states led by former rebel allies. Ethiopia and Eritrea mobilized large armies, dug trenches, used artillery, armor, aircraft, and human wave assaults in places, and fought a war that resembled older 20th century positional conflict. Badme became a small place with enormous political weight. The fighting around Badme, Sorona, Zalambesa, and other fronts was severe. Trenches, minefields, artillery barrages, and infantry assaults produced high casualties. Ethiopia eventually launched major offensives that broke through Eritrean lines in 2000. Eritrea accepted a ceasefire, and the Algiers Agreement followed. The border ruling later awarded Badme to Eritrea, but Ethiopia did not immediately withdraw. The result was a frozen conflict, militarized borders, and two states locked in hostility for years. In the 2000s, Ethiopia also fought in Somalia. The Islamic Courts Union rose in Somalia and took control of Mogadishu in 2006. Ethiopia, under Meles Zenawi, intervened militarily with US support and entered Somalia to remove the ICU from power. Ethiopian troops captured Mogadishu, but the intervention helped fuel a new insurgency. Al-Shabaab emerged as a major militant force. Ethiopia's army could take the capital, but holding political order in Somalia was far harder. Modern Ethiopia's most devastating recent war was the Tigray War, which began in November 2020. The federal government, under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, fought the TPLF, which controlled Tigray after falling out with the federal leadership. Eritrean forces entered the war on the federal side, and Amhara regional forces also became deeply involved, especially in disputed western and southern Tigray areas. The war became catastrophic. Cities changed hands, civilians were massacred, food systems collapsed, sexual violence, forced displacement, drone strikes, siege conditions, and mass death marked the conflict. Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, was captured by federal forces in late 2020, then later retaken by Tigrayan forces in 2021. The Tigrayan counteroffensive pushed beyond Tigray into Amhara and Afar, bringing the war closer to the national center. Federal forces regrouped with drones, allied troops, and renewed mobilization. The war shifted again. The Pretoria Agreement in November 2022 ended the main phase of fighting, but the settlement left unresolved questions over disarmament, disputed territories, accountability, political power, and Eritrean involvement. The Amhara conflict then became a major front after tensions rose between the federal government and Fano militia forces. Fano refers to Amhara armed groups with local support and different command structures, many of which had fought alongside federal forces during parts of the Tigray War. When the federal government moved to centralize regional security forces, fighting spread in Amhara. Towns, roads, and rural districts became contested. Federal troops faced irregular fighters who knew local terrain and could move through civilian areas, hills, and villages. Ethiopia's modern war map remains dangerous. Tigray's peace process is under strain. Amhara's insurgency continues. Oromo-related conflicts remain unresolved in several areas, and relations with Eritrea have deteriorated again. Red Sea access has become a strategic issue for Ethiopia, which lost its coastline after Eritrea's independence. The old themes have returned in modern form: highland power, border war, coastal access, regional autonomy, armed nobles replaced by armed parties and militias. and the constant struggle to make a large state obey one center. Ethiopia's war history is not a side chapter in African history. It is one of the main military traditions of the continent. Aksumite expansion, medieval Christian-Muslim frontier wars, Ahmad Grang's near destruction of the empire, Oromo military transformation, Gondarine court conflict, the era of the princes, Tewodros at Magdala, Johannes against Egypt and the Mahdists, Menelik at Adwa, Haile Selassie against fascist Italy, the Eritrean War, the Ogaden War, the fall of the Derg, the Eritrea-Ethiopia trenches, Somalia interventions, Tigray, Amhara, and the unfinished wars of the present.